Ford did not hesitate to disagree with his former colleagues where fundamental principles were at stake, and they certainly were not bashful about returning his volley. Resolved to cut spending, he vetoed no fewer than 66 bills. When's the last time an American president did that? A White House staffer rubbed his eyes in disbelief as the president's good friend Tip O'Neill, so jovial and confiding in the Oval Office, turned harshly critical in front of reporters on the north lawn of the White House. "He's saying terrible things," the young man reported to his boss, who never looked up from his desk or removed the pipe on which he was contentedly puffing. Dawn, that's politics. Gerald Ford was a better president than candidate for president. His campaign song in 1976 trilled, "I'm feeling good about America." And if its message was by no means universally applicable, even adversaries conceded the profound contrast between the nation's mood in August 1974 and the bicentennial summer of 1976. His campaign for the Republican nomination stabilized after a string of primary losses in the South and West. Still, Ford courted every vote as if his political life depended on it, as indeed it did. Dick Cheney, who is one of the people who have been interviewed for the book and tells the following story, so blame him, not me. Dick Cheney, who had succeeded Don Rumsfeld as chief of staff, was understandably alarmed when Secret Service agents shot an intruder who had somehow managed to scale the White House fence. His look of shock dissolved in laughter as an agent, well aware of the seesaw battle then raging for the soul of the GOP, mournfully remarked, "If that was an uncommitted delegate we just shot, we're in deep shit." It wasn't, and they weren't. When Queen Elizabeth II graced a White House dinner that July as part of the nation's bicentennial festivities, it is probably just as well that Her Majesty did not see the guest list in advance, for it was bloated with uncommitted Republican delegates and their spouses. Little about that year's contest followed a predictable script. The Ford-Carter match was the first conducted under post-Watergate public financing rules and to feature televised debates between an incumbent and his challenger. Perhaps the most memorable moment of those three encounters came in San Francisco on October 6, when Ford famously denied Soviet domination of Poland and other members of the Warsaw Pact. Now, I should have said, the Soviet Union does not dominate the Polish spirit, Ford acknowledged long afterward. I should have acknowledged that the Soviet Union had 3 or 4 divisions in Poland and therefore militarily dominated Poland. In fact, and this has always been forgotten, in fact, the incumbent couched his remarks within a larger defense of the controversial Helsinki Accords. He specifically referred to the people of Yugoslavia, Romania, and Poland, 3 Eastern Bloc nations he had visited as president, and whose warm welcome had convinced him of their pending liberation. When we redid the museum, and if you know, upstairs there's a television screen that plays the Polish gaff over and over again. One, I don't think Lyndon Johnson would have allowed that in his museum. But 2, when the president came through and saw it, he chuckled, and we reminded him that he wasn't wrong. He was just about 13 years ahead of his time. Anyway, all of that was forgotten in the media storm that ensued. Precious momentum was squandered as the president, who could be indeed a stubborn Dutchman, dug in his heels for 4 days before recanting. He quickly regained his stride and entered the home stretch, closing the greatest gap in modern polling. Almost. The combined effect of Watergate, the Nixon pardon, the GOP split, plus Carter's appeal as a morally driven outsider, proved too much to overcome. For all that, Gerald Ford's loss in the Electoral College was the narrowest since 1916, cushioned by victories in such modern-day blue states as California, Oregon, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Michigan. As I said, Bess Truman voted for Ford, as did George McGovern, and 3 weeks after he acknowledged that, he learned from Mrs. McGovern that she had voted for Ford as well. Rising above his disappointment, the president promised the smoothest transition in history. When Jimmy Carter visited the Oval Office for the first time, Ford was hurting. And there's no doubt Ford was depressed. Not clinically, but if you would be too. He extended his hand. He said, Governor Carter, I haven't had a chance to personally congratulate you yet. And they sat down, and there began, in fact, the smoothest transition in American political history. On his last night in the White House, he welcomed Nelson Rockefeller and his family as overnight guests. Days before, the outgoing president had bid farewell to Washington with a benediction that said as much about Gerald Ford's character as about his soul. I once asked you for your prayers, he remarked, and now I give you mine. May God guide this wonderful country, its people, and those they have chosen to lead them. May our third century be illuminated by liberty and blessed with brotherhood, so that we and all who come after us may be the humble servants of thy peace. The same words would be repeated on a January afternoon 30 years later at Grace Episcopal Church. Rosalind Carter wept quietly as her husband eulogized his one-time adversary and longtime friend. How Midwestern. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, I know questions, comments, observations, constructive criticisms. Yes?
You mentioned Cedar Springs and the Red Planet. My mom was good friends with the Clipper girls who read the newspaper up there, were early supporters of Congressman Ford. And I was just curious if you had any stories or reflections, because I heard many from the family.
Boy, I tell you, I don't, but you do, and it's important for us to get your stories, I'm serious, to get your stories recorded. There are undoubtedly people in this room who have pieces of the Ford story. And, I mean, we're actually talking about the possibility of organizing a systematic oral history effort before it's too late, because there are lots of people in and around West Michigan who could contribute pieces of history that would otherwise be lost in time. So I hope you will take the initiative to get in touch with Jim Kratzis, who runs this place, and share your stories. But thank you very much. Yeah?
I wonder if you would comment particularly on Ford's extensive use of the veto compared with President Bush's almost pride in not vetoing, but at the same time announcing selective non-enforcement of some of the provisions of the bills he approved.
Well, you know, Ford was, he wasn't frugal, he was cheap. He elevated cheapness to the level of principle, don't get me wrong. He was a fiscal conservative. He wasn't a supply-sider. He didn't think you could get something for nothing. He thought if you wanted a program, then fine, then pay for it. He didn't think that it was right to mortgage the future of our children and our grandchildren. By the way, something Dwight Eisenhower said in his famous farewell address. I mean, he was passionate about restraining the growth of government and government spending and taxes. And he was willing to, because he had no other weapons. He had a Congress that was overwhelmingly Democratic after the 1974 election. And so, he was willing to expend whatever political capital he had and confront his old buddies on Capitol Hill. One of the great ironies of the Ford presidency is, here's this man, very few people go direct, one person's gone directly from the House. Real trivia, Garfield, exactly. And guess what? They never tried that again.